Welcome to all of you this evening for the 19th edition of Art Matters, organized by the Raza Foundation in collaboration with India International Center. Every time we pick up a theme and try to explore it from various angles, we usually have a multidisciplinary panel. This time, we don't have that multidisciplinary. All the three persons are connected with visual arts. So you are going to have a heavy dose of visual arts. The theme that we have chosen for this evening is urban chaos and the arts. Now one can look at this theme in very different ways. How does urban chaos impact the arts? Does it make art practice more difficult, more peripheral? Does it allow the arts to absorb the urban chaos or to cope with urban chaos? Do arts themselves contribute to urban chaos in some sense? And all these aspects have to be looked at. It is no denying the fact that more and more cities are becoming chaotic. It seems that we are planning less urban order, more urban chaos. It is also planned chaos in some sense. Getting anywhere becomes more difficult. And there are other aspects. All kinds of people, the sense of community is lost, the sense of neighborhood is lost, a sense of belonging to a place is lost, a sense of the place is lost. And all these losses must be impacting the arts that take place amongst such urban chaos. So we have three panelists. Usually we had four, but one of them has disappeared. So we have three only. We have Ravi AGARWAL, we have RANJIT HOSKOTE, and we have PURI. Ravi AGARWAL is, besides other things, is a practitioner. RANJIT HOSKOTE is a poet and an art critic and a curator of, as they say, of international repute. And he is going to take part in an international poetry festival, so his internationality is rather vindicated in more than one ways. We have PURI, who is a reluctant speaker, somehow, but seem to have flown straight from into Delhi and has come straight from the airport. So I'm very thankful to her for taking us so seriously. We will start with her because she has some kind of a presentation. And maybe, yeah, but you make the initial presentation, then we...
Sanjay is going to play it for me.
Say.
I would like to first thank Ashokji, of course. See, I knew the market. This is the market that is reflected. Even there 4 days ago. Good evening, friends. First of all, I'd like to thank Raza Saab and the Raza Foundation for having us here this evening. Also Ashokji for convincing me at least to come and speak in such august company. Before I begin my presentation, what I would like to do is I would like to congratulate RANJIT HOSKOTE because we are extremely proud of the fact that he has been awarded the Sahitya Academy Purishkar for his translation of Ladid. So first of all, I think a big hand of applause to RANJIT. You know, I come from Bengal, I come from Calcutta, and Shantiniketan is close by, and while I'm a very proud Bengali, I have to also admit that staying away from urban chaos in a place like Shantiniketan hasn't really helped anyone very much where art making is concerned. I think it is the urban chaos, I think it is the stress, I think it is the sole problem of dealing with life on an everyday basis that really helps the cause of art. And I'll begin by sharing some images with you. So Sanjeev, if you could just run those images for me, please. So we have Anjum's work. All these artists, you will notice, have been either influenced or impacted by their lives in the city, by their experiences dealing with the urban space. Beju Pathan, End of Seasons. Bombay based. Beju again, it's here. Project Pallav. And there's Bhupen Kakar over here. In his inevitable style, George Martin. Another very different approach, but an approach nevertheless towards the urban space.
Sir, can we have the lights on?
Front lights.
Ranjit HOSKOTE had shown Gigi's career at the Venice Biennale showcase.
Yes.
With Zarina Mashmi and yeah. Jagannath Panda, of course, has been painting these, painting his stories. He lives in Gurgaon and is constantly talking about migration, having to move away from Orissa, how animals deal with this whole urbanization that's happening in Gurgaon. Just in one minute. Manjunath Kamath. This is also Manjunath Kamath. This is also Manjunath Kamath. very common sight if you happen to live in Bengal, which I found as well. Survival agree. From the soy also which one? So much good water from the So friends, what I'm just trying to say to you, I think this rests my case. The fact that most artists who are painting across the country now in today's time and age are actually drawing from urban spaces, drawing from the city. Now coming to my personal experience with one very special painter, collage maker, I had shown Shakila's work in Delhi. Manjeet and I had shown Shakila's works in Delhi some almost I think 15 years ago, and Shakila's whole method of working has been inspired by well, she was begging on the streets when Pani Sarji discovered her and taught her how to make collages. Since then she has been living in Noorpur. In fact, she still continues to live in Noorpur. And she works, making collages. So you have to give her, in fact, when you go and see her, the deal is, in fact, I'm going to be meeting her now on the 28th. She requests you to bring magazines so that she can cut from those magazines and she can use them for her collages. So the whole urban space and the fact that you're living in the city is what really inspires artists, I think. If you were to be living in a pastoral place and, looking at the river and birds, I don't think it really would have helped create much art.
So for creating art, you ought to be living amidst urban chaos and urban settlements, etc. That might be debatable, but we'll debate it later. If you are in pastoral circumstances, watching birds and trees and cows grazing around, that is not going to be much art, not of any consequence.
I'm not discussing cows here because of certain reasons. I shall not discuss cows, but yes, you have animals.
Yeah. Ravi AGARWAL, would you also like to go there?
Absolutely.
Sure.
I don't read. Raza and Dr. Vajpayee. It's good to see you there. When Vajpayee Sahab asked me, I said yes, but then I started thinking about what I'm going to say. So I just went, I thought, well, the word chaos has so many resonances because I trained as an engineer many decades back, and the word chaos is, as part of chaos theory, did not exist then. There was something called entropy, and entropy was about order and disorder. I'm still not sure, don't remember which is. increasing entropy increases order or decreases order. Maybe you would know better. But now it's replaced by something called chaos theory, and which really makes it even more complicated. This idea of chaos in a deterministic system. So I was thinking of the word chaos and what it means and what planned and unplanned. And I think that no matter how much you plan, the idea of the unplanned has been very much part of the cities we live in. But I'm really like a bacteria which thrives on filth. I thrive on urban chaos. And all my instincts have been about urban chaos. And I also thrive on watching birds and cows in the urban chaos because they very much exist in the same landscape. So what I thought I'll do is I'll show a few images, some of the very early images. And the photographer when I was much younger, and these are typically instinctive images one takes as a street photographer. And as a street photographer, you're really wrapping your camera around your wrist, you have a fixed focal length, and you're letting your eyes do the journey. And there was no digital at that time, so you often saw the images much later. So you didn't even know what you were shooting or what you were photographing. So the act of photographing became a part of creating some order amongst the chaos. And the instinctive eye was trying to create order. And the images which came from that sort of 3 or 4 years of work, which is not work, it was just fun, walking the streets and photographing. And they all have something in common about them, and I'll talk about what that is. As you can see, they're trying to bring order to a completely unrelated objects. And this is just the eye working, something which is not conscious. It's almost semi-conscious. In another state, you are taking these pictures. But essentially, it's trying to find some order in that space. And very much the camera was part of my space at that time. It was very much my private space, my ability to find my little retreat into myself. And what one realized when I was walking the streets was that there is not one city. So even if you walk the old city like Chandni Chowk, you could be watching the food stalls, you could be watching the mass of people and trying to create some order out of it. But you could also be engaged with different communities in different kinds of narratives in the same space. So over time you realize that there is a community which lives there, there's a trading community which lives there, there's a whole commercial activity, there's a grain market, there's a spice market, there's a flower market, and they all run parallel. And also that this was part of an ecological space, a river ran through it at one point, and it's also a place for a massacre. So as in any space, the way I engage with the space created the narrative for my work. And so the spaces have not really changed, but what I see in the spaces has changed over the years. Familiarity with the landscape is very much part of my work. I need to be there for a while before I start reacting to it or unreacting to it. And even that changes over time. So I think this complete practice of a certain kind of order, which I think many photographers have talked about, is certainly very much part of me thriving in that space, because this is what was exciting for me. And the subsequent works were also dealing with the idea of the changing city. And a lot of my work is to do with the idea of the changing city and my relationship with the changing city. These are some works which are part of the reconstructed city. They were photographed between 2008 and maybe like 2007 and 2010 or 11. And they really talked about, to me, about how the city was changing as I was looking. And this is the construction of the new airport. These are some new developments on the edge of the city. This is another major construction. It's the construction of what you call the Giza Colony Bridge. This is the construction in the South Delhi market. This is also a new construction on the edge of the city. And to me, what made me react to them was there was some energy which I got from looking at these pictures. And it's hard for me to define what that energy was, but it was in some way how the pictures spoke to me at that moment. And often I find that those pictures ought to speak to me later, if they speak to me. It's that leaving that moment as a moment which I cannot visit while I'm engaging with it, also makes me should film a lot, because then I really don't know what I'm doing. And I think I like that containment of that energy when I'm in that space and I'm trying to when I'm seeing something. And it's a multi-layered engagement with the city. I do environmental work, and that's also an engagement with the city. But it's an engagement which deals both with the spaces, the politics, the power relationships, the commerce of the city, and it's something I do on an ongoing basis. There's some images from those. Myself reacting to different kinds of spaces. Even the idea of engaging with the non-chaotic, the quieter spaces, is actually a counterpoint to being in a very, very active and dynamic city. So my work with nature, my work with looking at natural spaces, with rivers, with the forest in Delhi, both as an artist, as an activist as well, has some resonance in the idea of the counterpoint of chaos. So chaos is always the center, I think, of the engagement. And this idea of finding quietude in that is also something which I will not see outside the frame. So, for example, this picture is from the demolition of the Yamuna Pushkar in 2004, but this is taken in 2010. And this, it's just a tree which has grown now. And if you go now, it's just a bigger tree. But for me, it was a very quiet image. And the image, and that quietness doesn't exist outside the frame. So, because there's so much, everything else going on. So this engagement with that frame becomes a way of my engaging with that quietness within myself. This is some of the different kind of work. It's a creative work.
What site is that? What site?
These are in the rich forest.
Northern
Delhi.
village or
This is in Sanjeevan.
northern?
Sanjeevan is in south central ridge, behind the Kerala.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful forest. And these are also, again, some constructive works. These are other kinds of works. The idea of waste, livelihoods, commerce. This is a project I was engaged with called the Yamuna Railway Project, Project Y. And this is a view of that. On the right side is the GG sculpture, that massive 30-meter fountain out of it. And just on the left of it, we see Shiva Chachi's sculptural female form, which you can get in the video. But this project again was on the banks of the river, and it was, I was not an artist, but a curator in this, and the idea was to think about the river differently. And I remember people coming and saying, but why would you want to do a project on this filthy river? And when we did the project, people said that this is really beautiful space. Of course, the space has its own politics, and because it's the Yamuna Pushta space, and it's also the proposal for the new city, the new park there. But the idea of reimagining space and re-energizing space, recreating space, is very much part of, for me, what public art can mean. And of course, this project had many other resonances and questions when we did it. But again, this was done on the banks of a really filthy river. You know, somewhere, something you would not, some place you would not normally go. But again, there is this idea of the river which is very different than what that general narrative of the river is. This is another work called The Sharp, also the banks of the river. I just wanted to show you some images from a project I did, again a public art project on the idea of extinction at the 48 Degrees public art project. And this was done outside the National Gallery of Natural History Museum. And the idea was to think about what's happening to the city, and because the city had a whole host of vultures. You know, we have lost 97% of the vulture population in South. This was to think about the vultures, and only 2 vultures left are in the Natural History Museum, and they're stuffed. So it was pictures and videos which I created, and a little diorama I created inside the museum to again think of what the city had lost, what is the idea of extinction itself. So I really can't think of a practice outside the urban space. And including some of the works, I was also very informed when I was growing up, because my grandmother used to live in a village in Rajasthan, and we used to go every year for 2 months in this really barren landscape where you had to pull water out of the well, and we had bajra and added the food, and we went in a camel cart. There were no roads. When I was 17, till I was 17 and 18. But I remember, I know that much of my landscape ideas are informed by that space, the idea of landscapes in space, and they keep coming back to me. In a video I did called the Sewage Pond memoir, in which I recollect the idea of that landscape. So I see them as points and counterpoints, but certainly very much part of the urban space. And I think many friends of mine, artist friends, also thrive in the idea of urban space. Maybe urban artists have more visibility and they circulate better. That could be possible too. Because there's so many stories of artists retreating. I know artists in Germany who retreat and do completely different kinds of work. So who's to say? But for me, this is the space I live. I'm sorry, I couldn't show you the last one.
Like to speak from there, or you go there? Yeah. Hope your mind works. Let the lights get on.
The lights can be on. I have no images. It's just words.
Words.
Also, as I might have said before, I'm getting to the age where I can either see you with great clarity or read what I've written here. So I'm going to try and be bifocal. But let me begin a little more formally. This is working, right?
No.
No, just to say that it's always a privilege, I find, for me to speak in Delhi. Because when I come here, there's a sense that there is a continuing conversation about matters of great public urgency, and this gets done in a way which links intimate, personal, artistic, or critical experience with matters of state and the public sphere and so on. And there's a very different kind of tonality and texture to this. So I want to thank Raza sir and Ashokji for this opportunity, and it's wonderful to be speaking here with friends and colleagues like Ina and Ravi. And having said that, I have to say that what I will try and present here is a little at a tangent to the presentations that Ina and Ravi have made, but I'm hoping that this will connect in some way. And my inspiration here is Marshall McLuhan, not for anything he thought, but I mean, some of you will remember him with vexation and others might remember him with delight. But when it was pointed out to McLuhan that a great deal of what he did was unsystematic, verging on charlatanic, he would say, you know, I'm not really in the business of systematic thought. Treat what I'm saying as a mosaic or a probe. So, you know, if that works for McLuhan, it certainly works for me. So what I want to try and present here is 5 mosaics, if you will. And what I want to try and do is to take these terms that you presented to us, urban chaos and art, and try and see if one can work from, if you will, an etymology or a genealogy of these terms, and see if that kind of looking etymologically or genealogically can bring us to some appreciation of how these terms actually condition or define our lives and our practices. So I'll begin with chaos, which is a condition that I'm particularly fond of because that's something that I seem to thrive on personally, but I come to it, unlike Ravi, who comes to it from an engineering and technological perspective. I would come at it more from the perspective of myth. And if you look at chaos from the perspective of myth, you find that it does some very particular things. In the first place, it is classically, in the Greek account, the opposite of cosmos. I mean, the great polarization which defines how the universe comes into being at all is this dichotomy of chaos, which is this condition of disarray, if you will, and cosmos, which is an ordering principle. So when we think of chaos, we are typically thinking of conditions of disorder. We are thinking indeed of the second law of thermodynamics, and the very reassuring knowledge that our lives and our universe are heading unstoppably towards heat death and this entropic end. So we keep thinking of breakdown and dysfunctionality when we think of chaos. But if you go back to that mythic account, I think we might be able to derive a slightly different narrative there, because chaos is also the necessary prelude. It is a ground of origin from which all your cosmic narratives might derive. Without chaos, cosmos is quite meaningless. So I'm going to try and argue in what I'm going to argue here, that we might be better off looking at chaos, in fact, as, in its own strange way, an ordering principle. But the order that it produces is not static order. And I want to link some of these thoughts to this notion of how we see the city. And it's a sort of commonplace with us, and also because we are troubled by everyday facts such as traffic and housing and so on and so forth. We tend to characterize the metropolitan condition as being one of chaos. But I want to say again, in light of what I've tried to mark out as this notion of chaos, I want to say that many of our cities, even the most colonial of them, actually encode the specters of different kinds of unfinished projects. So I think there's a particular quality to the chaos of our cities. It's not just random Brownian motion type disorder. Sorry, I'm backing you, really. I think what we're looking at much more when we look at cities, whether it's Delhi or Bombay or Madras or Calcutta, we're looking actually at these different unfinished projects and their residues and their specters and their phantoms. When I look at many of these cities, I think that maybe somewhere at the bottom, in the bottom stratum, there is still the cosmic diagram of the Nagar, the Sanskrit city, the Sanskrit cosmopolis with its well-ordered divisions. of sight which corresponded in some way to community, ethnicity, caste, and all of that. So I think that that's in some sense a basic phantom in our cities. And what remains of that diagram and its vexations and disquietudes, because it was not perfect, it also encoded forms of division and hierarchy. I think also our cities encode the sheher. There's the phantom or the spectre of the sheher. There's the Mughal city, the Lodi, the Tughlaq city, the way in which spatiality was distributed, the way in which certain communities were arranged according to a diagram of power and access. Again, the forms of that earlier template, along with its vexations and disquietude, still informs much that we do. And I'll pin all these abstract thoughts to what I'm going to say about art in a minute, if you'll bear with me. And then there's, of course, the colonial city, which broke with the Nagar as cosmogram, it broke with the Sheher and its particular distributions of power and access, and it produced a radically different kind of political asymmetry. And typically, to me, Bombay is one of those examples. There was a very specific distinction made in that kind of city between the colonial fort, well-ordered, and the black town or the native town. And that also is an inheritance that in Delhi it might well be Lutyens and non-Lutyens, and so on and so forth. North Calcutta, the fort. So I don't want to labor this point, but I think that this spectrality is still very much with us, and the way in which it is melted down informs in very particular ways the so-called chaos, which, as I want to show, is not chaos so much as a kaleidoscope of all of these things. And that, of course, leads me to the fourth of these strata that I'm trying to sketch out, which is the post-colonial city, where all of these prior half-broken diagrams are further re-engaged by the turbulences, the circulations that we faced from partition onwards. We're looking here at migratory populations, deepened asymmetries, new forms of production and new economies, all of which have led us to this sort of situation that Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, describes as the condition of liquid modernity, where all fixities of self and other, all notions of lack and surplus are in constant renegotiation. So if there's one kind of motif that I want to sort of emphasize for our present discussion, I would say that it's this constant renegotiation of self and other, and of lack and surplus, which defines what is at stake, really, if you will, in this urban chaos, so-called urban chaos of ours. And how does all of this discussion map onto the space of art? I'm very glad, actually, that we had so many examples from practice that came up in everything that Ina and Ravi showed, because I really sense many of these urgencies alive in these questions. Because what I've just sketched out is a very conflictarian kind of set of premises. And art has always somehow been characterized by its practitioners as a protected space, a space of sanctuary, a space of retreat, if you will. And somehow many artists and many of us who write on art continue to hold that notion very much as a cherished notion, that art is a protected space, it's a sanctuary, it's a retreat, it somehow has the privilege of being cut away from things, and yet its fundamental conditions are as I have sketched them out to be. So rather than think of urban chaos as debilitating, I think it's enabling for very, very specific reasons, not only at the level of subject matter, not only at the level of, say, a transition from one kind of medium to another, but also because it forces art to get out of the space of retreat and sanctuary and to take responsibility for its own being and its own conditions. And I'll try and sketch that out in the last two mosaics that I have here. This has to do primarily with how we imagine the studio. And today the studio, especially in the context of many, many expanded practices, such as those of what is called public art, maybe we can dispute this later. What is public art? Right. Also the form of the installation, the social project, and many other expanded practices where art simply cannot afford this sanctuarial kind of approach. We find that the studio has been entirely transformed. Today it can be as small and portable as the laptop. It can be as vast as the metropolis. It can be as distributed as a set of interlocutors. It could take the form of a questionnaire. So when we talk about the art object, it really isn't there in a classical sense. It instead is distributed in many of these ways. And each one of these distributions that I've sketched out brings it directly into encounter with this series of conflicts and broken diagrams that constitute the city today. So what I want to suggest at the end is that not only is urban chaos a research object for many artists with expanded practices, not only does it provide subject matter or call for a shift of medium, but it reminds artists, or it provokes artists now to take very seriously two rubrics. One is the notion of the public, and the other is the notion of infrastructure. And this happens also because there's a meltdown of institutions. You know, one of the reasons why art could afford for a few decades, or even perhaps a century and a half, to see itself as a sanctuary is because it was underwritten by institutions, like the Academy, which had its very clear rules, like the studio, like the gallery, like the museum. Today there's, in many, many instances, there's been a complete split between the brick and mortar form of the institution and its function. You might have an academy which is properly constituted and regarded as a place that hands out certificates and degrees. But actual pedagogy may have moved on to the peer group, to reading circles, to the net, and to other kinds of distributed networks. You might well have a museum that does what it has always done in terms of conserving objects and annotating and providing a certain educational program. But the work of the museum, in terms of protecting archival resources from earlier, or fossils of some kind, or relics of prior forms of art making, often that function is migrated to other kinds of groups or other kinds of platforms. So it's actually within this kind of situation, not only of expanded practices, but also of shifting institutional frameworks, that I think artists have become much, much more aware of how urban chaos prompts them now, for instance, to do about 7 things that I've listed out here, and which I will now inflict on you. One of them is that artists have recognized quite clearly that they have to operate with an expanded sense of community, and that community is not the traditional community of viewers. You know, for many artists, I find, dear friends too, their instinctive understanding of a community is basically a community of viewers who are going to respond to their work. And you have to say there are other ways in which communities are constituted and how artists can connect with them. You know? This leads automatically, so to speak, to the fact that many artists are now working with subaltern groups or communities that have been marginalized, that do not have access to social capital, to education, and so on. So there's a whole variety of projects, artistic projects, that take on, as, if you will, an ethical mandate, such communities. That, to me, again, is something that emerges from the conditions that urban chaos makes possible. Artists also now address, through the medium of urban chaos, the deficits of knowledge and skill. They realize that they cannot simply rely on institutions to provide for these skill sets, forms of knowledge, and so on. Very often you have to go out there, address that chaos, and address those deficits. And I'll conclude with some examples so you'll know that this is not just abstraction. There's also a very strong awareness of the transdisciplinary condition of art making. I'm not for a moment decrying more traditional or conventional forms, such as the painting, the sculpture. All of these have great value and always will. But what we're seeing now is emergent forms of art making that almost instinctively transgress the old disciplinary boundaries, that work with technology, with activism, with cinema, with documentary, and a whole range of these experiments are actually, in my reading, a response to how to deal with this productive chaos. And as I said, this means really that we have to take seriously the fact that these new expanded practices are reconstructing and reimagining what it means to have public space at all, to reimagine the public sphere and how people of different kinds, from different starting points, as imaginative subjects are operating in the public sphere and actually creating it. And this has, I think, very significant consequences for how we imagine our democracy, and I hope that will come up a little later. And as I said, the other rubric which we're reminded of here is that of infrastructure. And this again is critical because it pulls us away from traditional conceptions of art as being connected to inspiration and to the inward-looking making of the art object or the artwork. We are reminded now that infrastructure is also an artistic project. And some of my examples as I end will demonstrate how this is so and why it's important. In Delhi, I would, for instance, among many examples, I would certainly signalize Khoj, the Khoj initiative, which began as a residency program and which has now grown way beyond that original mandate to embrace many of these things that I talked about. I would also signalize the Cyber Mohalla initiative that came out of early work at Sarai, at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and eventually has gone on to produce, I mean, in developmentalist rhetoric, one would speak of it as an empowerment gesture, but it's really way more than that. What Cyber Mohalla has produced is a whole new generation of people whose origins are in the shanty towns of Delhi. It's almost not Delhi. But these are people who've now, through this being in this experimental space of Cyber Mohalla, they now are writers, they are art makers, they are documentarians. So it's really, from my point of view, it's not only an edifying but a very inspiring narrative about how, when artists take up questions of the public space and of infrastructure, you actually have these quantifiable and amazing results. In Bangalore, I would think of spaces like One Shanti Road and Jagar, where again you have the mixed hybrid platform, where what might be seen as chaotic and confusing gets mediated and modulated into a whole series of projects that produce a new kind of sense and a new kind of knowledge that comes from within art practice. And in Bombay, I would think of initiatives like CAMP and the Clark House initiative. Again, these are groups which are tactical in their response to the city and its experiences. They're transdisciplinary, they're also mobile, and they're made up of a changing cast of characters. Artists, writers, sociologists, activists, all of whom come together and develop, like some of these other projects do, new forms of knowledge and new infrastructural inputs. And I will, in another sort of gesture, leave you with not a thought but a word. A posthumous collection of Guattari's writings was titled by his disciples Chaosophy. And I think, again, I want to take that away a little bit from Guattari's kind of reasoning, but offer that to you as a conclusion for this set of mosaics that I've tried to share with you. Because the term chaosophy again reminds us that chaos is in fact a very productive source of knowledge. It's a ground of knowledge. And it's really in that spirit, I think, that we should embrace rather than run away from these ambient conditions that sometimes plague us. Thank you for your attention.
Well, now, if there's something that you would like to discuss between yourselves or ask for clarification, that is the panelists. This is the moment for the panelists to speak to each other if they want to. Otherwise, we will open it to the house.
So can I speak something?
Yes. Just a minute. We'll give you the mic. Just wait. You speak your name.
I am Colonel Nehra. I saw that on the video it was written, urban chaos. The first thought which came to my mind was my wife. It is regarding my wife. We live in a flat, and right from 4th class onwards, my wife started collecting books, copy books. Then she started collecting crystals, stones, all types of birds, animals. And somebody who entered my house used to say, "What a chaos! How can you live in this house?" My wife said, "It needs some eyes, somebody to appreciate my work. Please don't say it's chaos. it is in my heart. So the word chaos is with the artist. Now the artist, I don't know what they are looking for, but to a layman like me, I am looking for solitude, tranquility. What you said, the art could be in sanctuaries and all. You are right in a way. Through the landscape, the artist takes you in a heaven. Out of the depression, he takes you in a heaven where the thoughts, the good thoughts come to your mind. Then there is another thing to this chaos. This urban chaos is being hyped more, increased many folds by political chaos, which is now taken over all types of chaos. Now chaos is prevalent everywhere. Now another example which had happened with me, I was traveling with my wife. She is very fond of scenic beauty, landscape. We were traveling in a car and my brother was driving. All of a sudden my wife, she took my pet name and said, "Look how beautiful, the moon had come out from the clouds." And my brother also looked outside and then there was chaos. So,
What is your question, if any?
pardon?
What is your question, if any?
My question is, urban chaos is something which is with us, day-to-day life. It is how you see it. What benefit you want to take it from this chaos. That is what it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice. Rukmani? Raise your hand so that.
I'm Rukmini.
No. Take it.
So this may not be, it's quite a naive question, but when Ranjit was speaking, I was reminded of a poem, it's a very famous poem by Wallace Stevens, which is called The Idea of Order at Key West, and the central poem in that is called The Connoisseur of Chaos.
Yes.
And it says a great disorder, as I'm quoting from memory, that a great disorder is an order and a great order is a disorder. These two things are one. And that's a very common paradoxical idea of, what chaos might be. But what I wanted, when I was looking at your art, and very fine examples, one of the things that struck me is that, in a way, the visual impression is so dominant that the things, the assault on the ears, the noise of urban living, that is out of the frame, as is indeed, the dust on your skin as you travel. So almost all the senses are excluded in this artistic order. And one of my questions was, you require a lot of energy to get those back. My question is, what would those energies be to recover? Because you're relying on my memory, my knowledge of urban chaos to interpret that, and a lot of that is to do with all our senses. The other thing is that, the other question I have, my first question is, how do you recover notions of chaos which are sense-directed, which you don't get? My second question is, a city has an emotional topography. Cities are great places of disgust, of fear, of darkness, as are rural areas. And that emotional topography is something which I would like to understand more in understanding how art is related not only to politics, infrastructure, studios, and so on, but to our being, to how we emotionally are constructed differently, maybe, in a city and in a non-city, although I don't know where a city ends and something else begins.
Any of the panelists would like to answer?
I think it's a recovery. Recovery requires a common imagination, a common experience of something. I think maybe you recover through your experience of. I think a lot of this, what you're saying, is probably encoded in the work. This idea of multi-sensory ideas and you're cutting out, you see. But I think they're not really cut out. We're just not, like sound is not cut out in a photograph. Or time is not cut out in a photograph. It's just coded in some ways. And I can't say how, but it gets coded inside that space, I feel. And that's what makes me connect back to it. There's an evocation from that. So even things like politics and these all get, I think it's intuitively coded for the world. I can't engage with that in a separate form.
I mean, I completely agree with you that many of these projects, I think that both Ravi and Ina were looking at, and also what I was gesturing towards, actually are aimed at precisely the two things you talked, or three things. One is the need to bear witness to affect, and how affect is coded into the everyday. I think there are, what am I thinking of? Again, it's a project led by Raza to go into specific sites within the city, including a public library and several other such sites, which City Studio, where in one sense you're going into a site that is so naturalized and normalized that you don't really respond to it anymore, but to probe it in such a way that, or read it against its own spatial grain, in such a way that you actually retrieve some of these memories of affect and associations and all kinds of things that can't be reduced to discourse or words. And also I'm wondering if one of the problems, if it's a problem, is in the way in which one has to present work like this. And there's no way in which an installation, an immersive environment can actually be presented in this kind of context, because there's a bareness and a being bareness to it which you can't replicate, even if it's a video documentation. But just to say that there are indeed many projects which work after the sensorial turn, and they actually want to get beyond the art object or the artwork that is uncommunicative, sealed off, complete within itself. So, what's your notice?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about basically is the painted image. You're talking about the painted image, and that's where, that's what you're looking at. But beyond that today, there are other practices that look at so many different things, and they engage with communities, and it's actually things that you really experience out there. It's not just standing there in a gallery and just looking at the work of art. So I don't know, maybe.
Can I say something? As an artist, I'm an artist, and I sort of also used to paint, and then recently have been somehow motivated to move into other media because I felt that maybe the image is not
Good. Not
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So for me, there were certain personal or different reasons. But very recently, there was a public art project in Surat, which I was a part of, and my work was a sound work only. There was, nothing to see. It was at the Science Center, and I've been sent photographs by curators of, families and people who walk in there to look at the science exhibits, listening to the sound work, and I was told that it kind of completed the picture.
Yeah.
So I guess one way that we artists would handle what you are saying is to just move into different media. And as Ranjit was saying, this whole new shift, and the studio now becomes a mic or a laptop or a completely different medium.
Or a video game.
Or a video game. Sound. I'm doing sort of sound installations, and when people are in videos, yes, definitely, because that sort of brings everything together.
I think what you also said applies to literature and cinema, because everywhere there are these experiences are kind of limited to just that one visual or to that audio experience. Unless you're out
Somehow
there.
I think the city makes us much more aware of these limitations. It's
Rukmini, if you remember Sardar Hashmi and the street theatre, somehow I thought of it when you said the dust and the grime of the city. So performance art, I think, is also trying to deal with.
Places don't have dust.
Yeah, exactly. So people are just out there, in the street and
Another question.
performance.
Question for.
Yes, go ahead.
So I'm wondering, when we talk of other mediums and experience, this whole complete experience, is it just that we've lost the language of what we call classical mediums, of interacting with them, or that we need, or we live in a different world that we only sensorily experience many more ways of, otherwise we can't experience. But is it not to say that when you watch a Night Watch or you watch a Last Supper or something, you don't have a complete experience in that sense, and they're not. It doesn't many ways. Why is this need for constant multi-sensory artworks?
Yeah, which is why, I don't really want to set up a hierarchy or commit us to some narrative of progress where all previous art seems to have somehow fallen short of the mark. I think we just need to look at the objectives in each case. There's a considerable kind of aura, condition of two-dimensional surface, or are you at large somewhere else in the city? And here I'm thinking of the foundational text of modernity in some ways, which of course I've forgotten the title, Baudelaire, The Man of the Crowd, or is that Poe?
No, it's
Or The Painter of Modern Life.
yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, it's that incredible image of the man at large in the city, whose condition is that of the shock. You're moving at random through different kinds of vistas that have opened up in the city, and then it's a shock. Sorry.
Benjamin, you mean?
And then Benjamin picks up on that in the Arcades project. So there's that whole lineage of Poe, Baudelaire, Benjamin, where it's about a certain mobility, it's about shock, and it's I rather like that phrase now that I've got it, the bibliography of the senses, which you're reading through, picking up on. It just opens up a very different form of not only art making but being. Doesn't take away from anything done before, or from the photograph. And maybe also something you said, Ina, about cinema. It's not only the image, of course, it's also the fact that you are being agitated by subliminal patterns of editing.
That's right.
So I think this question of movement is radically central to many of the things we're talking about.
In the middle of all this, how did Laldev happen? You work with such, you're kind of dealing and engaging in so many different kinds of art practices. Just tell me, it's I know not a part of this discussion, but I'm just very curious to know about Laldev and how you started how the idea came to you about translating Laldev.
Oh my God!
Just a quick question.
Brief answers. One is it's part of an ethnic heritage, and it began that way. But over the 20 years that I worked on it, it was the beauty of the text. It was questions of whether it's a single author or a lineage of anonymous contributors. The whole range of questions that fascinated me, and that eventually it's the word. It's this complex tapestry of words that's
right. Something that would require, I would imagine, possibly all your time. It's such a complex, kind of a difficult narrative. So and translations aren't so easy.
No, it's a commitment that you make, and
it is.
As we are doing here now. We're translating, as I see, from different kinds of frames of reference to.
Well, is there any other question? I hope not. Well, thanks a lot. Ravi Agarwal, RANJIT, HOSKOTE, and PURI. The next session before we hold up for summer is going to be on the 22nd of April. Art Market, Art and Criticism. This will be the theme. on the 22nd. In the meantime, the Raza Foundation is publishing a new journal. We have done 2 already, and this is the 3rd one, called Swar Mudra, which is in Hindi and devoted to classical music and classical dance. And it's being launched on the 3rd of April in Alliance Française at 6 p.m. by Yamini Krishnamurti, to be followed by a discussion on उपस्थिति, अनुपस्थिति, शास्त्रीयता और आलोचना. मतलब शास्त्रीयता तो उपस्थित है और उसकी गंभीर आलोचना अनुपस्थित है. इस पर विचार करने के लिए, और उसमें शुभा मुद्गल, गीता चंद्रन, मंजरी सिन्हा और सुनील कोठारी भाग लेंगे. तो आप सब आमंत्रित हैं. निमंत्रण तो आपको जाएगा, पर तारीख तो अप्रैल में हम 2 बार मिलेंगे, अगर आपकी इच्छा हुई तो. यानी 3 अप्रैल को अलियांस में, 22 अप्रैल को यहाँ. एंड थैंक यू वेरी मच. May I present bouquets to all of us three.